5 years ago, I set out to do something that had never been done before. To create a phylogenetic tree of Pokemon life. And I know what you're thinking. Dude, I've seen a Pokemon tree of life before. But trust me, this was different. This wouldn't just be a tree that looked at the real world creatures Pokemon were based on. The aim was to create the most accurate Pokemon world tree of life. And how was I going to do it? Well, the clue's in the name. I do it using Pokémon Genetics. DNA. It's well established that Pokemon are DNA-based life forms. And as I'm sure you nasty Pokemon masters already know, Pokemon can inherit traits through breeding. I'd use those to build my phylogenetic tree. To be specific, this tree. Yep, I know it's not easy to read, but once I've told you how I did it, we can take a closer look. This all started a long time ago, all because of one man. Hold on, it was Birdkeeper Toby again, wasn't it? Yes, in 2018, Toby announced his project to create YouTube's first Pokemon Tree of Life, a highly ambitious project that sparked my tiny little imagination. As a recent biology graduate and an occasional Pokebio content creator, it was an idea that I really loved. Not only did I make a video on it at the time, but I was also lucky enough to play a small role as a subject matter expert consulting on parts of the tree. However, the approach just never quite sat right with me. I wanted more. I didn't just want to know what animals, plants, or fungi Pokemon were based on. I wanted a true phylogeny that actually represented how Pokemon evolved in their world. And so I started this project all by myself somewhere between 2019 and 2020. And like a good scientist, I decided to carefully select my variables and test my hypothesis before going all in. That meant looking into what Pokemon could and couldn't inherit through breeding to determine which parts of their biology I could reasonably say were genetic. For those of you who haven't seen my TM video from 7 years ago, you'll know that moves are the biggest dataset we have in this area. Moves can be inherited and passed from generation to generation, proving that they are backed by genetics. The other major inheritable currency I chose to include was abilities. Now, those aren't the only things Pokemon can inherit through breeding. There's also stats, but I think I'd rather eat a poison type than try and deal with that absolute nightmare. Instead, the final factor I chose to look at was type. With Terapagos and Terastallization, these days type is more ambiguous, but at the time it felt like a reasonable assumption that type was at least partially backed by genetics. Still now I believe Pokemon have access to all types, and that their current type is more of an epigenetic thing. I'd also consider dividing the tree into egg groups, because their ability to reproduce with one another could reasonably be used to justify their closer relatedness. However, Umbreon Libris created this fantastic graphic showing how interconnected egg groups actually are. It made me just want to put them all in blind and see what happens. I digress. Taking these variables in hand, I now had to test my theory. My hypothesis was that by looking at what moves Pokemon learn, the method by which they learned them, their types, and what abilities they had, I could score Pokemon based on their relatedness. The higher the score, the more related they would be. And the way I was going to test my theory was actually very simple. If the method works, then Pokemon in the same evolutionary line, different forms of the same creature, should rank as more closely related than similar but unrelated Pokemon. And what Pokemon did I select for this test? Well, where better to start than the first route Pokemon were ever caught on. I manually compared and scored Pidgey against its evolutions, as well as against similar Pokemon like Spearow's line and a few of the other Route 1 birds from other regions, in addition to completely unrelated Pokemon like Geodude. And the results? They were perfect. I saw exactly what I was hoping to see. Pidgey showed us more closely related to its evolutions than any other Pokemon, despite how similar many of them were. As a scientist, I naturally repeated the experiment with other evolutionary lines to make sure that it wasn't just a coincidence, and I was delighted to get the same results. At this point, I knew I was onto something. However, I had a major problem. Comparing every move a Pokemon can learn and the level or method by which they learned them to the entire moveset of another Pokemon takes ages. If I was going to continue to do this manually, it was going to take me a lifetime. At this point, I honestly got pretty down. I was on the verge of cancelling the entire project. But in my hour of need, a hero appeared. A computer wizard and fellow Pokemon enthusiast, my friend, Professor Carvalho, came to my rescue. The two of us met through Toby's Fuji Discord server, and he liked my idea and he wanted to help. And oh boy, was he about to help. Carvalho is a PC prodigy, and using his expansive Pokemon databases and complex computer algorithms, he was able to automate the entire comparison process, saving me months, maybe even years of work. Together, we discussed the scoring criteria and came up with this system. The system prioritized moves learned by level up, even more so if they were learned at the same level, as those are moves that Pokemon naturally learn as part of their life cycle. Once again, we tested it and we got positive results. We knew that this was going to work. However, nothing is ever that simple. Happening around this time was one of the biggest controversies in Pokemon's over 20-year history, something that sent fans into an uproar, the likes of which we'd never seen before. When it first happened, I wasn't even that bothered. It was only when trying to complete this momentous challenge that I was hit with the real gravity of this game-changing Nintendo decision. I'm, of course, talking about Dexit, the death of the national Dex. You see, we were making this chart based on the latest games at the time, which was Sword and Shield. However, not all of the 893 Pokemon that existed were going to be in the game. Furthermore, they made some substantial changes to the way that moves worked in Sword and Shield that meant that Dexit was about to divide Pokemon in two. Honestly, I'm not really sure what we did about it. Regardless, we persevered. It was more important for us to focus on overcoming the hurdle of comparing every single Pokemon's movesets, abilities, and types to that of every other Pokemon as well as themselves. Thankfully, Professor Carvalho's technical wizardry made doing these comparisons very efficient and a million times more accurate than they would have been if I was doing them all by hand. At this point, we decided to remove all of the pre-evolutions. Both of us agreed with Toby's logic that despite all Pokemon stages besides baby Pokemon being sexually mature, the final evolutionary stage of a Pokemon represents its most mature and desirable form. While it doesn't have to breed, reaching its final evolutionary stage is going to be a Pokemon's instinctual goal, as doing so is going to improve their chances of successfully reproducing. If you want to learn more, I've got a video on that topic. Furthermore, the pre-evolutions had just served their purpose. In the comparison, they showed that Pokemon in the same evolutionary line were more related to each other than other species 100% of the time. Leaving them in would have only needlessly bloated the graph. Now, we just had one final step: to make our tree. We took that colossal spreadsheet and ran it through Mega, a tree building software used by evolutionary biologists. And bam! It was done. We start here with some kind of universal common ancestor, and we get an immediate split and a branch with a Pokemon all on its own. That Pokemon is Ditto, which obviously, just has one move. There's nothing else that it can be compared with. That's why it splits off all by itself. So in this case, it would essentially, you could think of it as like a proto-Pokemon. So obviously there's the theory that it is a failed clone of Mew or Mewtwo, and that's totally possible. But this chart would sort of indicate, I guess, that it was a very early form of life, one of the earliest forms of life, can sort of do anything and adapt to any environment. The proto-Pokemon either evolved down this adaptable path and became modern-day Ditto, or Ditto is a proto-Pokemon and it's just carried on. With Pokemon, you never know. In the real world, it would have to be the first, but in Pokemon, it could be the latter. I have no idea. But yeah, that split leads us to two major splits here and gives us this group, containing Puku, Mewtwo, and Wobbuffet. Again, I don't really know why. We'll move on. If you have any thoughts on any of these things, just let me know. I think it'd be interesting to see split here, and gives us this branch. But I think what's really interesting is, again, this was entirely based on movesets, abilities, and types. So there is some variability where stuff is being grouped by types, and obviously movesets, they're going to be quite type dependent, which is why I think type doesn't really matter that much. It didn't factor that much into the final score, because whether they're electric types like they are in this case, those are just going to be grouped by the fact they all have electric moves rather than their typing. It's not going to play too much into it. But I think what is really interesting is you have this sort of group here. So this group here contains Dedenne, Emolga, Raichu, Togedemaru, Morpeko. So it contains pretty much all of the Pikachu and Pikachu clones, which is really interesting. But it's also got Heliolisk here, closely related to Raichu, which I think is very odd, closely related to these ones as well. More so than Togedemaru, who split off earlier, which is fun. Morpeko is then in with the electric dogs. So Luxray, it might be a dog, it might not, but again, purely based on the movesets these Pokemon have, they were grouped into electric dogs, which I think is a really interesting thing that this graph does. And this will pop up a few times. It's been a long time since I've looked at this graph, but I do remember that it has a knack for grouping things quite well, like in a surprisingly almost real world way. Here we have Rotom all by itself, split off from this group. Again, an earlier split. Toxtricity. Porygon Z in with Klinklang and Magnezone. Again, very cool that it's grouped these, but Porygon Z in there, which, you know, obviously it's man-made Pokemon, but whatever, we didn't factor any dex entries or anything into this. Stunfisk as well, all on its own. But from this split, so you have a bunch of electric types over here, and this split goes into some bug types, which I think is really interesting, with Galvantula and Vikavolt over here. In this split, quite far removed, essentially, from the electric types over here, these ones pop up, and they pop up more closely related to Pokemon like Durant. So again, Steel and Electric, indicating maybe a connection between the two types. Aselgor, Butterfree, for some reason, in with Volcarona, which I think is quite a weird thing to do. But this is the sort of stuff that I really like. Shedinja and Ninjask grouped more closely together than other bug-type Pokemon. Again, it's a good sign that the graph is working well, almost. Like, it's when Pokemon like this are grouped together, it's really, really cool. Anyways, that's that big branch there involves some bunch of bug types, steel types, and electric types. The other then major branch comes down here, again, splits two ways, so we'll follow it around. It's branch into some groups. So this group, I guess we'll just go through it, doesn't really matter. So up here we have some psychic types grouped together. Alakazam, in Reuniclus, Musharna, and Behem. But also with Orbeetle, which is fun. It's linking Orbeetle more closely with than with other bug types. No, Gothitelle. I thought it said Growlithe. I was like, what the hell? But no. So again, bipedal, kind of bipedal, kind of bipedal, no, bipedal psychic types up here. Again, closely related to Meowstic and closely related to Gallade and Gardevoir, once again put next to each other. Mr. Rhyme and Mr. Mime put next to each other again. And then Indeedee and Hatterene. So this is the group of psychic types that are bipedal, which is, again, I just love the fact that all on its own, purely based on genetic data, so the movesets and everything like that, is grouped these bipedal psychic types all into one big group that's branched off here from bird psychic types. Like, that's such a fun thing that these would have been some psychic type common ancestor down here. They radiated into two different complete categories. So it went bang. Okay, these are going to be the inanimate psychic type Pokemon, and these ones are going to be split bird type psychic type Pokemon, including Noctowl. So Noctowl is obviously not an actual psychic type, but must get enough psychic moves to put it in common with Pokemon like Xatu. I think that's super cool. And then obviously these humanoid, apart from Musharna, bipedal psychic type Pokemon. And again, very positive sign for me that it's grouping Gallade and Gardevoir. It's grouping Mr. Mime and Mr. Rhyme together. It's a sign that closely related Pokemon, again, really two forms of the same thing, they're being closely grouped together, and that's very, very cool. So if we go back a bit, split all on his own, Malamar, poor thing, but one of my favorite Pokemon, so that's cool. Fairy types over here, so again, closely linking Slurpuff, Alcremie, Aramise, but also closely linking them to Ribombee, Klefki as well. And here we have a bunch of ghost types, so Ghost Fairy, Ghost. Mimikyu's all on his own, branched off very early in the ghost type evolution. Obviously we don't know what it looks like, and it seems like very much just a shadow, so maybe it's one of the earlier ghost types who's been around a very long time, and that's why it's so lonely. You know, maybe that's why it wants to be loved. Split here, Chandelure and Ninetales. That Ninetales would be so closely related to these other Pokemon is very interesting, because again, like the way the scores work, the way that the analysis works, and the way the software works, no, Ninetales would have been compared to every other Pokemon, as well as itself, the highest score it could possibly get would be with itself. Based on its score compared to other Pokemon, every other Pokemon would have been ranked on like the most closely related, the next one. And the software's taken that information and grouped all the Pokemon together based on it. So that Ninetales comes out here, in with all these ghost types, is very, very interesting. Because yeah, I mean, it's a whole group full of ghost types. It's grouped in with Gengar, Dusknoir, Sableye, Trevenant, Cofagrigus, Runerigus, Driflim, Gourgeist, and then just Ninetales, Chandelure. It's very interesting. And the other major split earlier in the life cycle then did give rise to Cinderace and Rapidash, who were in with Dubwool. And then that was also a split here. That gives you these other sort of fairy-type Pokemon on this side. Blissey, Clefable, quite similar. Wigglytuff as well, pretty cool, they're grouped together. Togekiss, Cinccino and Lopunny. And then again, this is one of the things I absolutely love about the results of this graph, right? Because here we have all the evolutions grouped together. You'd imagine all these Pokemon, because they're all different types, would have different movesets and everything like that, and they would be grouped further apart. Grouped together, Glaceon and Vaporeon, obviously the closest. Again, Sylveon, Espeon, it makes sense to me. Very, very nice. Love that. Going back up, so that was that big group here, but if we go back one split, bunch of grass types. So Flapple and Appletun, pretty cool. Interesting. So this says that Delmise and Ferrothorn are more closely related to each other, but they are both quite closely related to Duraludon, which is, again, quite interesting, like a dragon steel type mixed in with some dragon grass types. Interesting, but then some other grass types over here. Kind of weird. I think, yeah, from what I can see, we're heading into grass types, into this other big category here, which involves not all of them are bipedal, but ape, monkey. Yeah, pretty cool. So some ape Pokemon here with Shiftry, who's a bipedal, quite humanoid. Sarina is split off on its own from this group, which involves Executor. Again, split off from this group, which involves, well, some of the fungus ones. Amoonguss, Shiinotic. Quite closely related to Tangrowth, apparently, which is pretty cool. And there was a split earlier on, so common ancestor that went into these fungusy ones and that vine thing. This one that then split off into, Eldos and Whimsicott share a common ancestor here. Comfey and Cherim, Maractus, Venusaur, Lilligant, Roserade, Blossom, Vileplume. Pretty sweet that they're together. Oh, and that's the end of that bit. So all the way up. So this big split here leads us here. We'll go down this path. Two big splits, whole bunch of stuff going on. So two big splits. So we'll start over here. So these are Wailord, Lapras, quite closely related to Milotic and Blastoise. Sure, Shell. I don't know. Again, if you have any thoughts on why these things might have come out more related, let me know. Or if you have your own headcanon on evolution, go ahead. Kingdra and Gyarados, Inteleon and Wishy-Washy. Interesting. I don't know why they would have been grouped together. Very odd. Split down here, so common ancestors between these lot and this lot. So Octillery, Mantine, and Seaking. These are very strange. This one makes a lot more sense. Tentacruel and Jellicent. So obviously two jellyfish Pokemon being grouped together. That's pretty cool. Gastrodon, Quagsire with Whiscash. Love it. I mean, ground water types, they're probably going to have very similar movesets, but to me, at least some of that makes sense. Interesting that, so Seismitoad, again, water ground type, is less closely related to Whiscash, Quagsire, and Gastrodon than Ludicolo. Very interesting. They both diverged at the same time, and Seismitoad is more closely related to Ludicolo than it is those ones. Again, Politoed, Poliwrath, nice to see them grouped together. So that's one big group here, showing a common ancestor going back to here with Starmie, Golduck, Slowking, Slowbro. These all have psychic-y powers. Golduck mixed in there, even though it's not a psychic type. Lantern, Cramorant, and Pelipper. So obviously, I mean, Pelipper, Cramorant makes sense. You'd expect to see Swanna in here as well, given the typings. Lantern is a bit of a shock. I'm not sure what that's doing in there. Cloudster, Gudra, Dragalge. Looking forward to maybe running a Clowitzer in Legends ZA. Crawdon, Kingler, very closely related to Golisopod as well. Makes sense. Araquanid being, like, these ones make sense, right? Sharpedo, Barraskewda, Basculin, makes sense. Predatory Fish. Araquanid. Again, if you were making a tree based on the origins of the Pokemon, you'd probably put Araquanid more closely related to them than these ones. But that's not what happened. We're going back to an earlier split. So this lot share a common ancestor with Quillfish, Toxapex, and Pincurchin. Again, poisony. Split here leads to this group. Ice types, Glalie, Frostlass mixed together. That's pretty good. Frostmoth, Beartick, Abomasnow. Nice. Dracozolt and Artizolt mixed in, even though I don't know what their movesets are like. Cursula and Corsola are being mixed together purely based on data rather than stuff like their name is really interesting to me. With obviously these are not individual, these are like abominations and not individual Pokemon. Avalugg, Mamoswine, I can see it. Going back to early common ancestor, that group divided from this group, which is just Delibird, all on its own, poor little thing. Again, common ancestor here, splitting off into this, which is some poison types. Scolipede, Drapion, I can see it. Vespiquen also in there with that bugness. And then Garbodor and Weezing up here. Common ancestor into Bravery and Mandibuzz. Pretty cool. Skarmory, Corviknight. Again, makes sense. Talonflame and Unpheasant's pretty interesting. They must have very similar flying moves. The fact that Pokemon's type can change so quickly, as we see with Alolan forms, they have quite different types, and we know that they evolved very quickly to get these different types. It's clear that Pokemon have a flexibility in their genetics when it comes to type, if type is backed in genetics at all. Farfetch'd and Sirfetch'd, very closely related via the graph. They have a common ancestor with this group, which is, Scizor and Escavalier mixed in with Aegislash. Now, some of this makes sense. Some of it, I guess it could be Insectoid, Aegislash, it could be... And this was done before Legends Arceus. Well, it was also done before the DLC, so you don't have all the Pokemon. I also don't think there's legendaries in here besides maybe a couple. In fact, I'm pretty sure we did one that at least involved legendaries and it involved the DLC Pokemon for Sword and Shield. I'll see if I can find that. I'm not sure where that is. They have a common ancestor here with this lot. Okay, so some dragons. Yeah, that makes sense. So Crustle and Gigalith. Honestly, that kind of makes sense. Gigalith, it looks a bit insectoid, a bit arthropody. So yeah, this is, these are rock types, right? So we have Crustle, Gigalith, Stoneger, Colossal, Sudowoodo in there as well. And they share a common ancestor with these ground types. So Sandslash, Excadrill, Dugtrio, this kind of mole Pokemon almost together. So this group has a common ancestor with this one. Okay, again, so Torkoal and Turtonator, some fiery turtles mixed together. Heatmore and Centiskorch. Okay, so Zoroark and Weavile, I can definitely see that. Bisharp also kind of gives me the same vibe. They're all sort of bipedal. And this, here, this is pretty cool as well. So Persian, Berserker, and Leopard, all in the same. So all of these cat Pokemon grouped together. That's pretty cool. Honestly, again, it's one of those things that I really like about this graph, where it groups these animals together just purely by moveset. Thievul, Obstagoon, and Linoon, again, cool to see related Pokemon related very closely on the graph. Grimmsnarl up here as well. Okay, here we go. One of the parts I really, really loved about this graph. So here we have a whole bunch of dog types. Zamazenta, Zacian, Stoutland, Arcanine, Lycanroc. These are all dog, canid Pokemon with very different types, right? Rock, fire, normal, fairy, fighting. These are all very different typed Pokemon. You'd imagine they have very different movesets, which is obviously going to be the main factor, right? Because the type itself is not a big factor when it comes to how Pokemon are grouped together. It wasn't highly scored, but obviously Pokemon of the same type are going to have similar movesets and maybe abilities because of their type. Despite that, these dog Pokemon were all grouped together and supposedly are very closely related. Dog Pokemon do have a sort of common ancestor, but that the electric dog Pokemon we saw earlier, these two groups are not closely related. In fact, there's a major split somewhere, right? Which group are they in? So they are essentially, there's a big split here between two groups like this group, and then I guess you could, taxonomy is kind of fucked, right? So you could, all of this could be one group, like this could be fish, right? But you have this small group here and this enormous group here that divided very early on. This group, as you might just be able to see up here, involves Luxray, Manectric, and Bolton, these electric dog Pokemon. And then the other dog Pokemon are over here. Well, in the Pokemon world, what this graph, this evidence is suggesting is that these two are convergent evolutions. They both hit on this, like this dog body form, despite very, very distant relations. This group is, bipedal fighting types, which is pretty cool. Very closely related to Sork and Throw. Sork and Throw, very close with Conkeldurr, Machamp, Pansimian, again all these humanoid fighting types, all pure fighting types, whereas you have these humanoid fighting dark types closely related to one another, Grafty, Urshifu, Pangoro. Interesting that those two would be grouped together, but again, humanoid fighting types in this group. Toxicroak as well, very early divergence. Again, love to see it. Hitmonchan, Top, and Lee. This suggests that Hitmonchan and Hitmontop are more closely related, which I find very interesting actually, because you'd expect Hitmonlee and Hitmontop to be more closely related, given they're primarily, you'd think they're both kicking Pokemon. Pretty sweet. So this is interesting. So this whole group here, right, this whole divergence from this ancestor here, is fighting type bipedal Pokemon, except for Pinsir, Tauros, and Bufalon. Now that seems weird, and at the time it definitely didn't make any sense. But now we have fighting type Tauros. This comes at a totally different time. This was well before Tauros had a fighting type, but the fact it's mixed in with all these fighting types is so fascinating looking back on this retrospectively, right? So this is normal Tauros closely related to normal Bufalon. You look at them, you'd assume so. Pinsir and Heracross, again, glad they're linked together, and Phalanx as well. It's quite insectoid, so it's pretty cool they're together. But this group is so interesting, right? It kind of makes me think that there is a sort of a shared ancestry somewhere in here that's fighting type. So maybe we have like a fighting type ancestor here, who then decides we're going to go this way, and it becomes Tauros and Bufalon. Fighting type Tauros would be maybe like somewhere in here, and fighting type Tauros then becomes normal type Tauros and normal type Bufalon, and continues to go into fighting type Tauros. But that same common ancestor that went off into be fighting type Tauros and all the Tauroses and Bufalons. And here we have fighting type Phalanx, fighting bug type Heracross, and bug type Pinsir. And what I would imagine is maybe something along the lines of, this might be a fighting bug ancestor that then lost its bug type to become Phalanx, but still had a sort of insectoid social behavior and fighting type. This one that has carried on and become fighting bug Heracross, and this one that decided to lose its fighting type and become pure bug Pinsir. All on his own, diverged very early on, was Grapploct. Probably because of grappling and all these other striking types. And that group has a common ancestor with this group. Yeah, Licky Licky, Miltank, Snorlax, Exploud. But yeah, these ones kind of make sense. But then you've got Marowak, Dunsparce, Mawilds in there. Fun, not sure what that's about. So there are there's some ground types mixed in, which is interesting to see them sort of popping up. With some steel types as well. Copperaja and Mudsdale. Beware and Diggersby. Both normal types. And then up here with so there are some dragons. So this group here is Flygon and Charizard, which is very odd. And then, Hydreigon, Haxorus, Crocodile's mixed in as well. So another ground type mixed in with all this lot. And then, so maybe dragons evolved from ground types, maybe. Very interesting. Rhyperior, Tyranitar, Hippowdon, Steelix. Like some groups of types, like there was another group of dragons somewhere else in here that is quite far removed from some of the other ones. I found that's really interesting to see these groups of what will be similar Pokemon looking at them if they're dragons or whatever, or dogs, like I said, not grouped together, but separated by quite some distance. Especially the dog one's really fun. It's fun to look back on. It's really interesting to see how it's shaped out. Pretty sure we did one with the DLC Pokemon included. I'd have to look that up. Let me know if you'd like me to go through that one as well. So that was the first time I've seen this in years. And the first thing to note, as I'm sure you've noticed, is that this is not a complete analysis, as we didn't include all the Pokemon. Realistically, there's no way of telling how including the other Mons would have affected the graph without just doing it. That said, with Pokemon Legends ZA on the horizon, soon all but 2 of the Pokemon are going to be on the Switch, so there is potential for us to do this again. However, that doesn't mean that all of this was a waste of time. Whether this was just a fun exercise or a real, if only partial, analysis, I will let you decide for yourselves. What I will say is it does do a great job grouping together related Pokemon species, for example, branched evolutions and regional forms. It is difficult to say why though. It could be a coincidence, or it might be because related Pokemon share lots of the same moves and abilities regardless of their types. If that's the case, then we have to ask why. Is the intent to show that these data points are a good indicator of relationship, or do they just want to give similar Pokemon the same moves? Overall though, I would say it's a positive sign. It also did a decent job grouping together Pokemon with similar body plans. For example, the dogs, cats, jellyfish, frogs and toads, as well as some Lepidoptera. Is that an indication they evolved from common ancestors, or that Pokemon with similar body structures have similar moves and abilities? Does the body influence the moves, or did the genes influence the body? Lastly, the branches depict a clear evolution of different groups of Pokemon types. Type is partially based on energy, but I'm confident in saying that it at least has some physical aspect to it, and therefore a genetic one as well. Pokemon have organs and tissues dedicated to helping them be the type they are, and use the types of attacks that they can use. If we start with Mew, or another common ancestor, I believe we would find ourselves in a world of generalists that can do almost anything in any environment. The first branch leading to a modern Pokemon was Ditto, who is the ultimate generalist. It can be anything, although it did highly specialize into that skill and can now only do that. Wobbuffet and Pyukumuku are similarly simple creatures that learn very few moves. I'd say quite generalist, but specialized into particular skills that suit their flexible lifestyle. The earliest type group to emerge was surprisingly the electric and bug types. That was a bit of a head scratcher, but I quickly realized that it did make some sense. In our world, a world that lacks an abundant energy that gives things supernatural abilities, there is one power that animals do have in common with Pokemon: bioelectricity, a topic I have a video on. So I figured if animals can do it using their body's own electrical signals, why couldn't Pokemon do it earlier and better using their bioenergy? Not to mention that electricity is the purest form of energy of all of the types. I don't know, to me it just kind of works. In the Cambrian equivalent of the Pokemon world, when the generalist blob started to specialize, much like in our world, two things would have happened that directly link to this power: the evolution of senses and complex movement. These things changed the game in the Precambrian and contributed heavily to the Cambrian explosion. These significant leaps forward were both made possible thanks to the evolution of the nervous system, sending electrical impulses throughout the body. Something curious though is that what makes bioelectricity and electroreception possible is water, and none of these Pokemon are aquatic besides Stunfisk. Maybe water isn't needed, or Stunfisk represents an early lineage. However, on this path, there are also bug types, two of which are electric bugs, so potentially the whole group came from that evolutionary path. Electric Pokemon that started speccing into bugness and eventually lost the electric altogether. The next major branch contains a lot of types: Psychic, Fairy, Ghost, and then another group of grass types. These are very particular energies, and I believe it represents a shift towards an energy-based lifestyle for these lineages. Fairy and Psychic get grouped together quite often in the chart, so there's a solid connection there. They're both special stat-orientated Pokemon that rely heavily on their type-based abilities. On the other hand, Ghost might represent a lineage that took advantage of this new niche that was opening up. Rather than eating their prey, they began feeding off the bioenergy of others, like a mosquito drinks blood rather than eating flesh. Meanwhile, grass types were evolving, possibly from a single or even multiple endosymbiotic events, much like the ones that sea slugs are undergoing in our world. Watch this video to learn more. The next major branch was the evolution of water type and ice type Pokemon. Water appearing this far on the chart might seem a bit late, and I understand that. Honestly, I'd love to get the fossil Pokemon in here so we can see how that would change things. However, a possible reason for this might just be that life didn't start in the water in this world like it did in ours. If Mew is the common ancestor of all Pokemon and Mew was then as it is now, then yeah, 100%. I do kind of doubt that it's remained unchanged over hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of years, but that's something for another day. Poison is the next branch, and that also seems a bit late to me because it's another thing that animals can do. Flying and Dragon were next, and following that, the lineage containing rock, ground, and fire Pokemon emerges. The ability to digest and incorporate rocks into one's own body probably did take quite a long time to evolve, whether they have it through their own power or through some kind of endosymbiosis. The inclusion of fire types here might seem a bit bizarre, but when you take a closer look, it starts to make sense. This group contains Pokemon like Colossal, Torkoal, and Turtonator, fire-type Pokemon that use rocks as a fuel source. Potentially, they evolved from Pokemon that could digest hydrocarbonous rocks, which learned how to get lots of heat out of breaking them down, and eventually turn that into fire, maybe expanding to use other similar materials as fuel sources as well. Where other fire types appear in the chart, they most likely evolved those capabilities independently, just like Alola Marowak did. Charizard, for example, might use waste byproducts like methane for the fuel for its fires instead. From there, the branches get a bit more vague. We get dark types, normal types, fighting types, and then this just group of mixed types at the end. These feel like the body was dedicated to the types more than the other way around. It's hard to say whether the body or the type energy came first, but for these, it seems like they have spec'd into bodies that are adapted for the type, especially fighting types, a type that focuses on physicality and technique. But if you have any theories or observations of your own, please, I'd love to hear them. Leave them in the comments below. I'd like to give a massive thank you to my collaborator, Professor Carvalho, for his tremendous contributions to this project. It literally would not have been possible without him. He worked on a game called The Call of Racket, which I played the demo of on stream. It's super fun and challenging, not to mention it's pay what you want, so please go check it out via the link below. Next, I need to thank Commander Z, who provided the artwork for my 31st Wooper tuber. They're a friend as well as an artist available for commission who you need to look up. If you need art, they can provide high quality goods quick as fuck. I'd also like to thank Toby for inspiring the initial idea, and Nick Rose, who directly inspired the creation of this video. They've both made their own trees as well as superb videos that you can go watch. And of course, last but not least, thank you for watching. When the generalist blobs are I've written myself a fucking tongue twister. Generalist blobs are starting to specialize.